to podcast number 6, everybody. This is your ABA help, and I am Sarah Ellenwine, and I'm here to finish the part 2 of what we talked about last week. So last week we covered lots of terms, lots of basic information, just explaining these terms and just talking about comparing, contrasting, just building that foundation for us, right? You know, there's no better word for it. Foundation, groundwork. That's where we're at. Podcast number 2 is going to be similar. We're going to finish up some of those terms. I added a few more in actually, so I'll kind of edit that graphic and update it for you guys. If you're watching this on YouTube, on podcast, I'll read it out for you. But I'm going to talk about the terms that we're going to discuss today, and we are going to discuss some terms. We're going to compare and contrast. We are going to kind of tie all this into the task list. So, you know, we've talked about environment, we've talked about response and behavior. Where does that fall on the task list? How does that apply? Like, what boxes can I check off in my head that I've learned, you know? That's what we're going to talk about today. And then a quick little note, we will go way more in depth with these terms when we get later into Cooper. You know, there's an entire chapter on MO, and there's an entire, you know, chapter on behavior, or there's an entire task list on behavior modification. So if you feel like I'm just grazing over these things, that's intentional, because the whole purpose of this part of the task list is just define and give examples. That's all we're doing, just making sure we understand the basics of these terms. We have our foundational knowledge, right? I am going to get right into this, guys. This part 2, so you already know what's up. You already know anything that can ramble on about, so we're going to jump into it. Alright, the terms we're going to discuss are reinforcement, reinforcer. So understanding the difference between those two words is really important. Same thing with punishment, punisher. And then we're going to talk a little bit more on consequences. I kind of want to expand on that one. There's obviously so much with consequences, but there's a lot of things to consider. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to compare and contrast reinforcement and punishment. We're going to talk about operant extinction / extinction is what we typically refer to it. Compare and contrast, you know, reinforcement, punishment, extinction, consequence, understanding the difference between all of those. How do you pick them out from each other? What are those keywords? We're going to talk about it. And then we're going to talk about the schedule of reinforcement, the basic 4, and then automatic and socially mediated contingencies. Then we're going to switch gears and talk about stimuli, stimulus, and stimulus class. Compare and contrast stimulus class and response class. Okay, so first up is reinforcement versus reinforcer. So reinforcement, I'm going to tell you the definition. Reinforcement is when a response is followed by a stimulus change that results in a similar response occurring more often. So breakdown of that is reinforcement is when we can see an increase in that behavior over time. We can say, yep, reinforcement has occurred, because we can see that behavior has increased over time. The most important principle of behavior is reinforcement. It's a key element of our behavior protocols. It should be the most important, essential, mostly used thing in our field. We should always be using reinforcement constantly, planning for it and constantly shooting for, you know, those positive experience with reinforcement. The definition for reinforcer. The consequence that is responsible for the reinforcement occurring is a reinforcer. Comes in 2 forms. A new stimulus added to the environment or increased intensity. An already present stimulus removed from the environment or reduced in the intensity. So you got those 2 different variations. Talk about it. So reinforcer is the thing that's doing the changing. So a reinforcer is the thing that you add to the environment, add to this person, the stimuli that you're adding, that changes that behavior and it increases it. That's the reinforcer. So reinforcement is the event has occurred. Reinforcer is the thing that's doing it. It occurs in 2 ways: when you add something or increase the intensity of that already present thing, or an already present thing that you remove or decrease intensity is how you can get reinforcement to occur in 2 different ways. We're going to make that make sense in just a minute if it doesn't, okay? So I'm going to kind of give you guys my insane pet peeve here. We don't know something is a reinforcer until we have a history of learning to see that that's a reinforcer. So this is going to be a question that the exam's likely going to try to trip you up on. Life, you know, when you're out in the field, it's going to try to trip you on. We don't know something is reinforcer. Example of that is, for some kids, they love cocoa melon. Other kids might hate cocoa melon. Some kids like cookies, other kids prefer savory things, so they would be more inclined to eat a Dorito. We need that history of behavior change in order to make that decision and see, okay, this is a reinforcer for this kid. A good classic example is praise. Not every kid likes it. Not every kid likes it loud. Not every kid likes clapping, cheering. Or some kids, your praise of saying, wow, good job, might be a punisher. They might not like it. They might avoid doing the right thing because they don't want you to cheer for them. I've had this happen with kids in the bathroom is a big one. So a lot of kids are shy. A lot of kids don't want people in the bathroom cheering for them when they pee, or it's really loud in there. Things echo. And when you get so excited because they finally peed on the potty the first time, you cheer. You're like, oh my goodness. This could scare them and punish that peeing. Keep that in mind when you're out in the field, guys. And a quick little term I'm going to slip in here is the I don't know how to say it, guys. The automaticity of reinforcement. It's the automaticness of reinforcement, basically. So behavior is modified by its consequences, regardless of whether the person is aware or not. So Skinner talks a lot about this one. It's just that a person doesn't have to know the behavior change is happening in order for it to happen. It can just happen. This is a good basic concept to know for the exam. We've got punishment and punisher. So for punishment, I'm going to read you the definition. So the punishment is going to be the opposite of the reinforcement definition. So we're going to be talking about a lot of opposites. Reinforcement and punishment are the opposites of each other. And when we get to positive and negative reinforcement and all that jazz, those are all just opposites of each other. Let me go ahead and tell you the definition. So for punishment is when a response is followed by a stimulus change that results in a similar response occurring less often. So decrease of behavior over time, that's all we're looking for. Same thing as reinforcement. Punishment is just the event. Same thing for punisher. Punisher is the thing doing the punishing. Definition for punisher is the consequence that is responsible for the punishment occurring and resulting in a decrease in behavior. Comes in two forms, the exact same way that I already talked about. And then my note for punishment, remember punishment is not just a timeout. There's a lot to it. There's 5 different components of punishment that you can use. It should be very meticulous when you use it. It should be the last thing that we use. Punishment should be something that is talked about with families. They're made aware that it's occurring. It should be in a protocol. Everybody should know how to use it and have checks and balances to make sure people aren't abusing it. So punishment is effective. It's fast. And when I say effective, I mean it works. You see results for punishment quick, but it's not a solution in the long term. It doesn't teach the missing skills. Punishment just decreases behavior. We need to have a treatment package with punishment, right, guys? Keep that in mind. Punishment is something that is so quickly reinforced in people. That's why adults love like spanking their kids and putting their kids in timeout, because it works most of the time, but it's not a good long-term solution. And that's where you see a lot of parents, once their kids start to get to 3, 4, and they can start acting out more, get really frustrated because it's not working anymore. Their kids, still defiant. They're still not listening. But punishment is so reinforcing because it gets you quick solutions, fast results. Your kids, not being a little, your kid's not jumping off a coffee table anymore because you just spanked them or you just put them in timeout. I bet you they're probably going to try again. The one exception of punishment being like the very last thing that you should do, or punishment should be something that, is just really shied away from, is in life-threatening situations or dangerous situations. So like if a kid is severely banging their head, this is something where you might want to consider putting in a punishment protocol and fading it out as quickly as possible, making sure parents are aware and all of that. But again, I would be very, very careful with that. Also making sure that your environment is modified and that your protocols are modified. If, kids are having severe SIB, reconsider all those things before you use punishment. But sometimes there are situations where it's warranted, or if a kid's running out of the house directly toward the road at cars, you might want to consider punishment procedure. But again, it shouldn't be a long-term thing. And then I'm going to go into consequences a little bit more, and then we're going to kind of compare and contrast what we just talked about, so that we can get, those answers right on the exam and understand the difference from each other and feel good and solid with that. These are all pulled directly from Cooper. There's a couple pages in Cooper where it talks about the stimulus changes that can affect consequences. There's a section in Cooper where it talks about these consequences and the different factors of consequence. So I just pulled it directly from there and we're just going to talk about it. So I think they're really good and valuable things to know and understand to understand the concept of consequence. And remember from the last podcast, we talked about how consequences are not bad things. We're going to talk about it, okay? So consequences are not bad. They're just what happens after the behavior. We know that, and that's going to be something that you're going to have to work on a lot with parents typically, because consequences just has a negative connotation. Same thing with like discipline. Like everybody thinks this, you've got to like punish your kid and discipline them, but giving them consequences is a healthy, natural thing. It occurs naturally all the time. Anything after that behavior, we like to see it, right? So consequences is kind of intuitive, but it's just important to make sure you understand this. Consequences are only going to affect future behavior. Consequences can't change something that just happened or is happening. It's going to only change those future behaviors. So you have to see over time if your consequence, intervention, or, if you have the right reinforcer or punisher in place to see if your consequence is working over time. And then behaviors are controlled by consequences. We learned this with Skinner. This is kind of that Skinner behaviorism came in. So like Watson didn't get the consequence part of the SR. He just stopped at the R. So he understands reflexes. He understands that we can do pairing and conditioning. And then Skinner came in and gave us that understanding of consequences are what controls that behavior over time. And then consequences is where response class comes in, guys. So we can kind of tie all this together. We can't give the exact same consequence to every response. So we can't control it that, fine tooth comb way where we can make sure everything is perfect. So we have to plan and program for those response classes and variations. And every response and every consequence is going to be reinforced slightly different. And that's why oversight of a BCBA is so important, because the second little things that are slightly off start getting reinforced, it can have like a snowball trickle effect. Think about it this way. Your preferred way to greet a stranger. So for me, I don't like to say hi, hello, how are you? So I like to give a friendly smile and a wave if I see a stranger. That's most interaction you're gonna get from me. I like to give a friendly smile and a wave. Just say hi is the maximum you're gonna get from me, because over time my history reinforcement has reinforced that response by giving me, the consequences that I enjoy. So like the person just walking. Whereas in the past, if I said hi, hello, the person might have come up to talk to me, and that might have been a very punishing experience, and I might not have liked that. So that person, coming and talk to me, that was punishment for my hi, hello. So that behavior over time has decreased, while my other behavior of just saying, a friendly smile and a wave as my greeting has been increased over time. Response class, right? And then you can use this understanding of how we have our behavior, our consequence, and what behaviors are being reinforced and punished, simultaneously over time, over your lifetime, things like that, to develop phylogeny and call back to our first podcast, second? I'm not sure. But phylogeny, selectionism, evolution, all of that comes back in, because you can understand over time those different characteristics that are reinforced and punished gives us those response classes and gives us the selectionism, gives us evolution, different traits that get carried on. This is where Darwinism gets hot and heavy. This is where it all kind of comes together. Like the example Cooper gave that I love to think about is how over time, different response classes, different behaviors, consequences have been reinforced, some punished, some not. Gave us giraffes with long necks, right? Selectionism, the giraffes that had longer necks and were able to have the response of reaching up higher or getting more leaves, survived, carried on their traits. You get it. Okay, how do we tell reinforcement, punishment, and consequences apart? They're all kind of similar on paper. They're different in life, so we're going to talk about it in the exam. These might be terms that they try to trip you up on. So how do we understand these? How do we pick them out? What are some keywords for us? For reinforcement and punishment, think about it this way. I am a person Reinforcement and punishment are things that happen to me. They occur to me, they're events in my life, they're things that I partake in, right? The environment around me has changed my behavior, increase or decrease it. It's an event. Consequences is the label for these events to occur. So the way I think about it is consequences is going to be kind of our top, and under consequences we have reinforcement and punishment. Consequences is just a label. It's a thing that is after the behavior. Again, society has used consequence as a negative word, so you tend to think of it in the same boat as reinforcement, punishment. But consequence is just the moment in time because it's just after a behavior. Consequence, concept. Reinforcement, punishment, happened to me, or event. A consequence is always going to be there, and then it's up to, the reinforcer, punisher that's happening, the event that's happening, to determine whether it's a reinforcement or punishment. Up next, we've got operant extinction. So operant extinction is the classic extinction that you probably know. Operant is just the actual name for it. Operant extinction is the removal of reinforcement of a previously reinforced behavior. We know that over time, we do not need to reinforce every single behavior. We can gradually fade out a reinforcement, and that's just a normal fading schedule. Ideally, it fades out to the natural occurring reinforcement schedules, that happens in a person's life. Extinction is when all of that reinforcement has been removed entirely and the behavior changes. The behavior should gradually decrease over time, or it'll just drop off in intensity altogether, depending on how heavily it was reinforced, the learning history of what was going on before extinction occurred and before the learning occurred. It should return to the previously engaged in. Under task list B for extinction, we're not going to go too much further because when we get into behavior modification protocols, we'll go a lot more into extinction because we're going to talk about like DRA, DRI, all that fun stuff. You guys know what I'm talking about. For extinction, just know it is the removal of reinforcement on previously reinforced behaviors, and some examples for extinction are the classic examples: little Johnny's at the grocery store wanting a candy bar in the checkout aisle, and mom doesn't have any money, she doesn't want to give it to him, or she's just tired of his screaming for it, so she decides she's gonna be tough, she's gonna put that behavior on extinction, so she never buys him another chocolate bar in that checkout aisle again. Little Johnny's not going to be happy about this. First couple times they go, he's going to be screaming, he's going to be crying, he might be kicking, he might be trying to throw, things off the shelf. That behavior is going to increase over time. At some point, there's going to be extinction burst.
All right, guys, so on the screen there is a beautiful little graph of baseline data and how we'd look at it as a BCBA. If you're listening on the podcast, definitely recommend popping on to the YouTube video and watching this. It's around 20 minutes is where this graph is at. But on the graph, I am showing my baseline data, showing you how it's a nice steady data collection, and then we move to our intervention has been introduced. So maybe it's mom not giving that candy bar anymore. We start to see an increase in behaviors. Usually we'll say increase in behavior anywhere from a day to a couple of weeks. It all depends on how long this behavior has been reinforced and how strong it is for that child. At the very top, the peak of those behaviors, the very top of the graph, the most intense duration or frequency, depending on what you're tracking, going to be the extinction burst. That's the worst day. And then after that, it should fall right on down. Typically, we start to see these behaviors go all the way down to minimal amounts and eventually should go to zero. We shouldn't see little Johnny throwing or kicking anything or screaming for that candy bar anymore if the behavior is not being reinforced. Because if you're using extinction, we've withdrawn all reinforcement. So we see it having very low rates. And this is as a BCBA, if you start to notice this is not happening, this is where you can start getting a little suspicious on what's going on. But anyway, what I am drawing on this graph right now is called spontaneous recovery. That's where after a day, week, a few months, it's kind of randomly the behavior just pops up again and you don't. Like I've said a bazillion times, don't worry guys, we will go more into this later. Just have the general idea and recognize that graph and recognize extinction and what it is.
Kind of the more modern approach on ABA, we shouldn't be using extinction as our sole behavior approach. It should be a part of a treatment package. At the very least, it should be part of a DRA. We should be teaching the alternative response because you can use extinction all you want, but if the kid doesn't know or the person doesn't know what to do instead, or doesn't know what to replace that with, they're going to find something else and it's probably not going to be appropriate, or they're going to seek out their needs in other ways. So it's like a really good example that I absolutely hate, I hope none of you guys are doing, is putting stimming on extinction. So we're no longer going to allow them, you can use response blocking, we're no longer going to allow them to stim, so that behavior of stimming is no longer getting reinforced. Over time, that behavior is going to decrease. So we put on extinction, it's decreasing. We might see an extinction burst occur where they are really frustrated because they can't stim, or they're really, you see a big outburst of emotions, or you see an increase in them stimming in other environments because, when they go home, parents probably aren't going to be able to put on extinction. So you put stimming on extinction, you're blocking it, it's no longer getting reinforced, they can't do it. You see that increase occur, extinction burst, it's decreasing, they're not occurring in nearly as much. And then one day you decide, all right, they've learned to not stim anymore, I'm going to stop using extinction, they're good. Guess what? Once you remove extinction, like I said, it's going to go back to the rates that it previously occurred at, which, for this learner, it was constantly. They're going to go back to doing stimming constantly because that's how extinction works. So same thing, like if, little Johnny's mom bought him a chocolate bar that one time, it might not mess things up, but if she starts doing it every single time, she's like, what? I'm going to buy a chocolate bar again. I got a raise at work. I can do this. And then one day she decides she doesn't want to do that anymore. Guess what? You're starting extinction over again. Those are things and concepts that we'll go more into with extinction later on. Just understand some examples of how to apply extinction, what it is, and the concepts surrounding extinction, and you'll be good to go. All right, reinforcement, punishment, consequence, extinction. How do you tell all those apart? So same thing, I'm a person, reinforcement and punishment happen to me. Consequences are the concept around those is something that's always going to happen. It's just the bucket to put reinforcement and punishment in because they're going to occur, and it's up to the environment to see which one happens first, punishment and reinforcement, right? So extinction again is kind of a consequence where it's a concept. So extinction is the removal of reinforcement. It's no longer occurring. It's a label to what's happening. It's not an event. It's not the thing that's occurring. It's more of extinction is a intervention strategy type of thing. And it's important to know that extinction is classical conditioning, whereas reinforcement and punishment is operant conditioning. Extinction comes up when we're talking about Pavlov and he's drooling for that steak, and then we no longer give him that steak. When that bell rings, you'll see extinction occur. Classical conditioning. So keep that in mind. Let's talk about the reinforcement. So we've got positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. You guys know these. We're going to go into them. We're going to give some examples. Make sure, guys, you have these solid, that you are so confident in these. These are easy questions on the exam to just get right and move on. They're going to be there. They're going to be in your everyday life. You have to understand how to use these and, program for them in your behavior modification protocols, things like that. You'll have to understand because this is how the people that you teach are going to learn all of it. Make sure you got these solid. So we're going to go into them. So a few little notes here before we get into positive, negative, all that jazz. These are the most common ways I see people kind of mess these up and struggle with these on the exam and struggle with these in real life is making assumptions. You cannot assume something's positive reinforcement or assume something's negative or punishment or whatever it is. We cannot assume. We have to look at the data. We have to look at the history. That's why we're a data field. We cannot make assumptions like, they probably like that. Absolutely not. It's based on the data. If that story problem does not tell you over time how the behavior was changed, it is trying to trick you. Do not let it trick you. That means we don't have enough information. If we don't have enough information, we don't know. And that's okay. It's okay when we don't know. We don't have to have all the answers, but we can't make guesses. No assumptions, period. If you're watching on the podcast, I'm going to have a little T-chart on the screen. I learned this visually. So for me, it's a very visual thing that I do when I'm trying to understand these and pick these out questions. I'm going to explain it that way. If you go by definition and are able to understand this just by definition and just see a question and just know, yep, that's positive reinforcement, or confidently understand that, good for you. Personally, I have to break it down and I have to really make sure I'm understanding what's happening in this situation in order to pull out the keywords and see, yep, this is increasing, that's decreasing, all that fun stuff. That's how I do it. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to demonstrate that. I'm going to try my best to explain it on the podcast, but if you're a visual learner, I definitely recommend checking that out on YouTube.
All right, so I am showing you guys the T chart that I use to visualize these story problems. I can visualize what's being added, taken out, and all that will lead me to the answer of whether it's positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. It helps me navigate it by seeing it visually. So let me show you. First, I draw my T, and then I put a plus and an up arrow, and then I put a plus down arrow, and then I do a negative. I put an up arrow, and I do a negative, and I put a down arrow. Okay, so what these represent, so we have a plus and an up arrow. That is positive reinforcement. I know it's positive reinforcement because in positive reinforcement, we are adding something, a plus, and the behavior is increasing, an up arrow. So the next one in the top right of the T chart is a plus, down arrow. So I know this means we're adding something in, behavior is decreasing, which is positive punishment. Bottom left, taking something away, behavior increases. Bottom right, taking something away, behavior decreases. We know what those mean. So for me, it helps me visualize when I'm looking at these story problems and I'm trying to determine which one it is. It helps me see and visualize and be able to grab out the question. So I'm looking at the question, I can see, okay, we are adding something in. All right, we're in the top part of the T chart. We're going to be taking something away. We're in the bottom part of the T chart. Okay, and then I ask myself next, is behavior increasing or is it decreasing? And that will help you land, okay, the behavior is decreasing over time. I know in this example, so if somebody's taking something away, behavior is decreasing. I know it's going to be negative punishment. For me, that helps me visualize it and understand it and being able to kind of approach those questions in a way that doesn't feel so overwhelming and manage the information for me. And I find it super helpful. I hope it helps you guys too.
Just saw the T chart on that. So I'm going to give you the definitions and we're going to give some examples and we're going to kind of apply that concept. Positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is a response that's followed immediately by the presentation of a stimulus that results in similar responses occurring more often. All this means is something is introduced to the environment that results in an increase in the behavior. So when we listen to these kind of definitions, let's break down what we know. So a response, we know what a response is. It's that single instance of behavior. We know what a stimulus is. We know that behavior has to increase over time for it to be reinforcement. So when we start to pick out those words, we can start to understand how these are occurring in those story problems, those questions. Some examples of positive reinforcement, you guys know this one. This is most commonly understood one, but I'm going to give you some examples. So adding in an alarm to increase waking up on time, giving a toddler a sticker for peeing on the potty. The sticker giving behavior increases the pottying over time. Same thing with waking up to the alarm. It's positive reinforcement because that person started to wake up and that behavior of waking up on time increased. We have teacher calls on you when you raise your hand in class. You raise your hand in class more now. You were positively reinforced. You liked that attention or, whatever your function was. And then this is something that will kind of make sense when you think about it on why a kid is better for mom versus dad or vice versa typically. Why they're so naughty for grandma or they're really good in school but really bad at home is going to be those differences in positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. It's going to be those differences in the reinforcement history, which is another little term to slip in there, is going to be important to understand when you're looking at why is this happening here, not there. We have behavior contrast occurring. It's going to be the differences in that reinforcement history for that learner. Negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is when a behavior increases when it is the result of the removal or termination of a stimulus. When we break that down, negative reinforcement is characterized by escape and avoidance contingencies. So what that means is negative reinforcement is occurring, it's, the behaviors are being negatively reinforced when that person is able to engage in escape or avoidance behaviors. Let me give you some examples. Your mom is talking to you after school, you really don't want to hear her, you're tired of it, you put in your headphones, she goes away, you don't hear her. That's behavior has been negatively reinforced, you're able to avoid mom. So negative, we've removed mom. Reinforcement of putting in the earphones to remove mom increases over time. Next time you go in the car, you just immediately put those headphones in because you don't want to hear mom. Every day that week, poor mom gets blocked out. And then smoke alarm beeping. So your behavior is negatively reinforced when you put those batteries in. The removal of that beeping increases that battery putting in behavior. So next time, over time, you're going to be putting in those batteries. And typically, with a history of reinforcement, you should be putting in those batteries faster because you want to avoid that aversive beeping. And like a good clinical example is a kid runs away from a therapist who's just giving them demands because they don't want to hear anymore, they're tired of it. The therapist leaves them alone. The kids learn that running away, escaping, avoiding, removing those demands from that person by running away is going to reinforce that behavior. And now we've got an eloper because they've learned that if I run away, I don't have to do it. So that behavior has been reinforced over time. Positive punishment is the exact same thing as positive reinforcement, just the opposite. Positive punishment, we're adding in something to decrease the behavior. So positive punishment is the exact opposite of positive reinforcement, right? We're going to take those same examples and we're going to flip them for positive punishment. I'm going to show you how you are taking away something or putting something in and how that can kind of change the situations and change the outcome here. So positive, you're adding something in. And then punishment, we're wanting to decrease that behavior. Adding in something aversive is the point of positive punishment. So you're adding something in to decrease that behavior. So you're going to be adding in something that's aversive to the person if it works. It's aversive. This can be accidentally done or on purpose. So we don't have to know it's aversive to that person. I have a really good example for you guys. I have a kiddo that I used to work with in clinic, and they're the sweetest kiddo ever. We didn't know they had this thing until we talked to parents. We didn't know that he was terrified of cows. Cows mooing, especially. Terrified of it. Like, absolutely, he'd instantly run away from it. We didn't know that. We had a button that had like different animal sounds, and one of them was a moo. And his therapist always worked with walking around with this button and clicking it, and every time it goes through that rotation to hit the moo, he'd take off running, and we didn't know why or what was going on, so we had to connect the dots. You just randomly, they'd be like playing with the button while they're hanging out with their kiddo, and he'd just take off. One day it clicked. One day we realized, and we asked parents, like, hey, is he scared of animals? And they're like, cows. He doesn't like that moo. It's aversive to him. It's loud. It's scary. He had a bad experience on a farm. And it all clicked, guys. For that kiddo, the moo sounds aversive. Other kiddos might not. They might love it. So you never know what's aversive to a person until you have that data to back it up, or you ask them, or you're able to see based on their communication and reactions on what they like and don't like. A big one is, kids with sensory difficulties. So bright lights, loud music, you might like it, they might not. Keep those things in mind when you are setting up an environment for your kiddos. All right, the opposite of those examples is adding in an alarm decreased your waking up on time. How this could work is, those people who like snooze and snooze and snooze, for them, adding an alarm might be aversive, and they might just instantly snooze it and go right back to sleep and avoid, what they're trying to teach themselves altogether. For those people, that's positive punishment. It's not working. Their behavior waking up on time is decreasing. They're oversleeping now because they're clicking snooze and they're going back to sleep, turning off their alarm. It's not working. Another example is, you might think stickers are going to motivate that toddler to go pee in the potty. That might not be the case. They might hate stickers. They might not like that sticky. So for them, adding in that sticker is going to decrease their potty behavior, because you try to give it to them after they peed on the potty a couple times and they're like, I hate this. they're going to stop being on the potty. They don't want that sticker. Up next, we've got the classic negative punishment. This is the one that you think of when you think of timeout or what you see on TV, what parents think of, the actual punishment consequence that is usually referenced when we talk about, punishment. Negative punishments. We're removing something to decrease the behavior. So if a kid is throwing toys in the playroom and you take away those toys in order to decrease their throwing behavior, that's negative punishment. In ABA, we try to avoid using punishment as much as possible, but there are situations where we do use it. You have to be mindful of those situations. And in Cooper, we'll go into it later. It'll talk about the different types of punishment. So for negative punishment, the big one that you're going to read a lot about is timeout procedures and how to remove somebody from an environment in order to decrease the behavior. So just keep that in mind. Understanding negative punishment is something you've got to be very careful with, especially when you start putting it in protocols. Insurance and things like that is going to start asking questions, as they should. Parents should get explanations on these. And same thing as positive punishment. Negative punishment should be done very quickly, very short term. Should be taken out as quickly as possible because we shouldn't be using punishment procedures as our go-to strategies like I talked about earlier. All right, a question that I always get a lot is negative punishment the same thing as extinction? Because in extinction, you're removing that reinforcement to decrease the behavior. So in your mind, you might think those are the same things. And I have the same thought when somebody first asked me this question too. I was like, wait a second. The difference here. No, they aren't. Extinction is the discontinuation of reinforcement, period. We aren't talking about an increase or decrease in the future behavior. We're just talking about the event of the concept of reinforcement being removed. That's it. That's all extinction is. Extinction, when you start adding in other things, turns into, differential reinforcement and all that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about just extinction. Removal of reinforcement, that's it. So what makes it different is when we talk about negative punishment, we need that history in order to see that negative punishment is occurring, because we need to know how is behavior being affected. Whereas extinction, we're just talking about that one instance. It's kind of like how response and behavior are different. Response is that one moment in time, whereas behavior is something over time, is a group of things, is something that is kind of like a bucket of things. Hope that makes sense for you. If not, Google it, and Google might be able to explain a little bit better, but they are not the same thing. And then automatic and socially mediated contingency is another concept that you'll see throughout Cooper. So we know what social mediated contingencies are. That is where another person is involved in the contingency, is involved in the reinforcement or the removal, is involved in the exchange, in the behaviors, right? Automatic is where there's not anybody involved, it's just you. So this is where automatic reinforcement, like sensory needs, are getting, reinforced or punished depending on the person. There's not gonna be another person involved in this exchange. So this could be like somebody biting your nails, and you could have, positive reinforcement. You add in your fingers, biting your nail, increases your nail biting behavior, stuff like that. Automatic, think about it. So like for automatic, think about you can automatically do it yourself. Social mediated, it's gotta be social. Another person. So now we're going to start switching gears to stimuli, stimulus, and stimulus classes, and then we're going to tie in stimulus class versus response class. We're not going to hit on them too hard. Those are really hard for me personally. We are going to talk more about them later, again, like I mentioned, but you need to know what they are, have the general idea, and kind of pick out what they are, explain what they are, pick them out in examples, and we're solid. Stimuli. Stimuli is the plural. Stimulus is one. Do whatever you gotta do to remember it. I don't have any fancy tricks to remember. I really tried. I did. I don't know. You just have to remember it unless you've got some tricks. If you do, let them comment below. Share it with us, because I honestly have nothing. I don't know. However, a stimulus, the definition of it, is an energy change that affects an organism through its receptor cells. Cool, right? Anything that interacts with our senses or we notice in our body is going to be a stimulus. So anything in the environment that we are interacting with, so each individual thing in the environment is a stimulus. You can group in many different ways, and that's what we'll talk about with stimulus classes, like how we group those together is a big teaching strategy. So you can do like a red ball, red marker, red cup, or you could do things that hold things. You could do things that are animals. You have all these different stimulus. Like, there's so many stimulus, guys, right? You know this. There's so many things in the environment. And that's where like stimulus class comes in, because we learn by grouping things together and categorizing things in our brain. No different for those that we're teaching, and how we will group things together through stimulus class, response classes. For stimulus class, we've got two different ones that we're going to focus in on for this task. Stimulus class, we've got formal stimulus class, and we've got temporal loci. I don't know how you guys say it. Loci. I'm probably wrong both ways, but we're going to say loci, and I'm really sorry if it's wrong. Temporal, loci, stimulus class. So we've got formal stimulus class. This is size, color, intensity, weight, spatial position in relation to other objects. Think about physical characteristics is going to be formal stimulus class. How I remembered this one is a little silly, but if it works, it works. Formal, dressing up for a formal party, I need to make sure I look good. I have good physical appearance, physical characteristics about me at my formal party. Yeah. So yeah, that works for you guys. And then temporal loci.
Okay, I just want to pop in here real quick to talk about temporal loci. I learned it as temporal locus. In Cooper on page 26 is temporal loci. I swear it's in there. I don't know if it's loci, locus. I'm talking about time, stimulus changes, stimulus class, all of that. I don't know if it's kind of like where stimuli and stimulus are the same thing, just one's plural and one's not. I don't know, guys. If you know the answer, let me know. I could not figure it out. Temporal loci does not exist outside of Cooper, apparently. So it could be temporal locus. If I figure it out, I will put it in the description box or pin a comment on YouTube to clarify. ABA is hard, guys.
It is the behavior and the environmental conditions that influence it occur within and across time, the temporal location of a stimulus. We already know what temporal is because we talked about it last podcast. It's time. So we know this one is time. It has to do its relation to other objects or behaviors in time. Did it happen before? Did it happen after? Stimulus class is going to be time. Right. The difference between a stimulus class and a response class. A stimulus class is going to be grouping up different stimuli, objects in the environment, categories, animals, size, weight, intensity, time, all that is going to be a stimulus class. Response class is going to be the changes in your responses and going to be how different things appear when we're responding to environmental cues, stimuli. Behaviors are going to be our response class. Stimulus class, objects, think about that. Think about the way things look, the objects. Response class is going to be the way the person is responding. We understand all that now. We're solid on it. We got it memorized. No question about it, right, guys? Let's tie it all into the task list. So I want you guys to be able to check off these boxes in your head, like, okay, I know B dash whatever. I know this one, I know that one. We've talked about it. We're good. And then as we move through this podcast, I'm going to continue updating you on where we are. And so we can keep checking these off and understanding, like, okay, we've made it through these things. That way you can stay nice and organized in your studying. Some people care, some people don't. Just so you know, I'm going to tie it in. It's going to be super quick. I'm going to talk about how the things that we've talked about, and give you a little brief reminders on the things we've talked about, how they apply, and what we've covered so far. Up first, we've covered B1. B1 is behavior, response, and response class. We know what those are. We're solid. One, a behavior, a response, and a response class. B2 is stimulus and a stimulus class. Just covered those, so we know a stimulus is an object. We know a stimulus class is grouping up objects by characteristics, size, color, weight, intensity, stuff like that. B3 is going to be in a couple of podcasts. I left out all the conditioning, the classic, because for me, those are very intense and very confusing, and there's a lot of similar terms, and I just wanted to get all of this stuff out of the way before we introduce super similar terms that you really got to study. Like, we're all familiar with Pavlov, but like being able to break it down and pick out story problems is really hard for me, and I imagine it's really hard for you guys too, so I want to be able to like dedicate an entire podcast to that and focus in on it and really make sure we understand it, because it is the foundation of ABA. It's Watson, Skinner in action. It's hard. But that's B3. We have not talked about that one, so don't check that one off. We can check off B4 though, because that is Okay, B4 and B6 are the positive and negative reinforcement, and then B6 is a positive and negative punishment. We talked about those, we grouped those together in this podcast, but you can check those two off. B7 is the automatic / socially mediated contingency. We know that automatic is involving just me, solo, one person, whereas socially mediated contingencies involve another person contingent on that. Skipped over B8. We went right to B9, which is operant extinction. We talked about operant extinction. Was it just extinction? We talked about the definition of it, some examples about it, to set removal reinforcement, and we talked about that little graph. I definitely recommend looking it up if you haven't seen it. And that's where we kind of end. We've hit on some other ones a litto bit, talking about those basic terms, but we haven't gone in and, provided examples and really talked about it. So I didn't check those off. I'm going to read to you guys the ones that we have left so that you know they're coming. So the ones that we have done, I just talked about, these are the ones that we are going to do that are on our to-do list. Ready? We need to define and provide examples of respondent operant conditioning. We need to define and provide examples of unconditioned, conditioned, and generalized reinforcers and punishers. We need to define and provide examples of stimulus control, examples of discrimination, generalization, and maintenance, examples of motivating operations, rule-governed and contingency behavior, verbal operants, and derived stimulus relations. All of those could have their own podcast. Honestly, they're all very big topics. Like stimulus control is huge. Again, we're going to hit on them briefly and talk about them way more later. And I'm still kind of breaking them up the best I can and kind of figure out how we want to do it. I'm going to be working on doing the audio mock for all of this content as well. My goal is 25 questions, but we will see what I come up with. All right, so that is part 2 of our basic terms, just talking about the 101 of ABA, reviewing these concepts, making sure that we can tell the difference between the other concepts, just slowly going through and checking off our task list B, building a solid foundation so we can move into those more complex thoughts and concepts like MO and, stimulus-derived relations and all that jazz. It's going to be fun. It's going to be great. I'm going to work on that audio mock to cover these basic concepts. I'm going to give you one big one so that way you can have something to just pull up and review. Go to part 1. There's quiz in there as well. I want to give you guys all the practice because this stuff is the foundation like we've talked about. Alright, like I said, that's all I have. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. I hope you're enjoying studying. I hope you're feeling confident. I hope you feel like you're starting to grasp this stuff and it's not so scary. I love the idea of going through these podcasts each week because it really helps break up studying and shows us okay, this week we can focus on these things. Next week we can focus on those things. We're going to make it through this. We got this together, guys. Leave a comment, like, subscribe. Let me know what you guys think. Bye, guys.